day, my students. Welcome to Your Menopause, Your Way, and the state of menopause in the world today. And welcome to the last podcast in the unit on heart attack. My goodness, can you believe all the information you've learned about heart attacks? Did you know there was so much to it? Did you know that it was even a part of menopause? As we've moved through the material podcast by podcast, have you been shocked? Well, if the other podcasts haven't shocked you, today's will. We are going to talk about diabetes at menopause. I know you're probably wondering why in the world I'd include it in a unit on heart attack. Well, you see, that's the thing. There is so much overlap between diabetes and heart attack that it's enough to knock your socks off. Actually, it's enough to give you a heart attack. So settle in and hear what I have to say. You're going to realize that there are so many connections between things you never, ever connected before. Get every woman you know to listen to this podcast, watch my videos, buy my book. If you haven't noticed, type 2 diabetes is rampant. And one of the reasons it's rampant is because people don't get the education they need to avoid it. I'm going to make sense of it in a way you've probably never heard before. And hopefully I'll make avoiding it or treating it a whole lot easier for you. You know I'm going to start with a definition, don't you? I love definitions. You probably already know that I love definitions. You probably already know also that there are two different types of diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is when your body doesn't make insulin. You have insulin deficiency. People who have type 1 diabetes get their diagnosis at a very young age. So another name for type 1 diabetes is juvenile diabetes because they're juveniles when they discover that they have diabetes. Deficiency of insulin is incompatible with life, so type 1 diabetics have to take insulin for the rest of their lives. We are not discussing type 1 diabetes today. We're discussing type 2 diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is when your body makes insulin, but it's resistant to it. In other words, you produce insulin, but your body has trouble using it properly. People who have type 2 diabetes get their diagnosis at a later age. So another name for type 2 diabetes is adult onset diabetes. And it used to be that only adults had type 2 diabetes, but now we even see it in children. And I'm going to tell you some of the reasons why. They are the same reasons that more and more adults are developing type 2 diabetes. Now, I don't like it when the definition of one term requires you to know the definition of another term because it's just not fair. So since the definition of diabetes requires you to know the definition of insulin, I'll define it for you too. Insulin is a hormone that your pancreas makes to aid in the digestion of your food. But insulin has one very particular and specialized job in the digestion process. It governs what your body does with sugar. So sugar is insulin's only concern. Insulin tells your body to either burn sugar as an energy source now or to store sugar as an energy source for later on. And the medical word for sugar is glucose. You know, when I was a kid growing up, there was a candy called Now and Later. And it's a lot later now than when I was a kid, but it's still around. And I think the name is really nifty, Now and Later, because now you're seeing that there's something to this now and later with regard to what your body does with glucose. So when you eat a meal, some of the nutrients are glucose, and glucose is present in many different foods, not just in sugar itself. All carbohydrates contain some glucose. All fruits and vegetables contain some glucose. All grains contain some glucose. And of course, all sweets contain some glucose. In general, the sweeter the food, the more glucose it contains. And your glucose is going to rise and fall throughout the day depending on when you last ate and on what you last ate, and on how well your body burns the glucose now or stores the glucose for later. Glucose is fuel for your body to use right now. It is supposed to be used quickly to give you energy now. It is not supposed to be stored for later. Fat is stored for energy later. So the ironic thing about the now and later candy is that the name implies something that you've probably never really considered. Your glucose will be lower before a meal and higher after a meal. So your glucose metabolism is really, really important. If your body does not metabolize glucose correctly, a lot of other things are going to go wacky. So the big issue is all about what your body does with glucose. Does it burn it for energy now, or does it store it for energy later? And insulin is what determines which it does. Burn it for energy now or store it for energy later. You know, you can actually think of this phenomenon of using or storing glucose like you think of money. You make money and you want to spend or burn some of it now and save or store some of it for later. So two piles of money may have different purposes. Likewise, your body is programmed to use different nutrients for different purposes. So you're supposed to use glucose now. That's the money you should spend for rent, food, and toiletries. It's what you use for immediate energy needs. And you're supposed to store fat. That's the money you save for later. It's in reserve so that you can utilize it in hard times when you aren't getting enough glucose for your immediate needs. It's just like if you're short on cash now and you dip into the money that's stored as savings for later. So what would happen if you had money but you saved all of it for later and had none to spend right now? You wouldn't be able to pay for your current expenses. Well, that's exactly what happens when your body uses insulin improperly. So type 2 diabetes is a situation in which your body produces insulin, but it causes too much of the glucose to be stored for later, and it stores it as fat. So that right there is the big connection between diabetes and heart attacks. That's why I'm discussing the topic of diabetes in the unit on heart attack. Because once sugar is stored as fat, everything I've taught you about heart attacks comes into play. In other words, type 2 diabetes puts you at high risk for a heart attack. Do you remember when I described menopause as an estrogen deficiency state? I explained that whenever your body is deficient in something, you have a long list of symptoms that tell you that something's missing. Diabetes, because with type 1 diabetes, you have no insulin. It's a state of insulin deficiency. But with type 2 diabetes, you do have insulin. Your body just doesn't know what to do with it. It's a state of insulin resistance. So to use our banking analogy, type 2 diabetes would be a situation in which you put all your money into savings for later and there's none available for you to pay your current bills now. You have money, but you just don't know how to use it properly. So even though your body has insulin with type 2 diabetes, there are still symptoms with insulin resistance, just as there are with insulin deficiency. So what are the symptoms of type 2 diabetes? Well, they include all of the following: extreme hunger, extreme thirst, extreme fatigue, dry mouth, frequent urination, headaches, vaginal yeast infections, dry, itchy skin, slow healing wounds, and numbness or tingling in your hands or feet. Now, those symptoms are quite attention-getting, but for some reason, most people don't discover that they have type 2 diabetes based on symptoms alone. Most people discover that they have type 2 diabetes from a simple blood test. When you get your blood drawn for your yearly well-woman exam or annual checkup, one of the blood tests is glucose. As with most things in medicine, there's a scale for glucose values, and there are different circumstances under which your glucose level is evaluated by the lab. So if you get your blood drawn when you're fasting, like first thing in the morning before you've had anything to eat or drink, your glucose values should be less than 126 milligrams per deciliter in the US, or less than 6.1 millimoles per liter in Europe and Asia. This test would be called a fasting plasma glucose. But if you have eaten, your glucose value should be less than 200 milligrams per deciliter in the US and less than 7.8 millimoles per liter in Europe and Asia. And that's because your glucose will be higher after a meal. This test is called a random plasma glucose. And if your doctor wants more control over how accurate the test is, he may give you something called an oral glucose tolerance test. This is where he has you drink a specific sweet beverage 2 hours before he draws your blood for the glucose test. And this is called a 2-hour oral glucose tolerance test. And the normal value for it is also less than 200 milligrams per deciliter in the US or less than 7.8 millimoles in Europe or Asia. Now there's one other blood test you might get to diagnose type 2 diabetes. It's got one of those crazy long names. It's called hemoglobin A1C, and it reflects your glucose control over the last 3 months. This is the test you'll get if you already have a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, because the idea is to keep your glucose under control at all times and over the long term. The normal value for hemoglobin A1C is less than 6.5% in the US, Europe, and Asia. So you are a type 2 diabetic if your values exceed any of these parameters. Fasting plasma glucose greater than or equal to 126 or greater than 6.9, depending on whether you live in the US or Europe or Asia. Random plasma glucose of greater than 200 in the US or greater than 7.8 in Europe and Asia. A 2-hour oral glucose tolerance test of greater than 200 in the US or greater than 7.8 in Europe or Asia. Or a hemoglobin A1C value greater than or equal to 6.5% anywhere. Now, because type 2 diabetes has become so common, there are now actually diagnostic criteria for something called pre-diabetes. Pre-diabetes means you're on your way to diabetes land, sister. It's supposed to be a wake-up call. It's supposed to make you say, holy cow, I better do something about this now before I actually end up in diabetes land. Unfortunately, most people don't respond that way. Most just go on with their usual lifestyle habits that got them in trouble in the first place, and they wait until they're completely diabetic and have no choice but to do something about it. We humans are very funny that way. We don't change our ways until forced to do so. So you've got pre-diabetes if your fasting plasma glucose is between 100 and 125 in the US or between 5.6 and 6.9 in Europe and Asia. Or if your random or 2-hour plasma glucose is between 140 and 199 in the US or between 7.8 and 11 in Europe and Asia. Or if your hemoglobin A1C is between 5.7 and 6.4% anywhere. Okay, so now it's time to tell you why diabetes is important at the time of menopause. A while back, I gave you a podcast on the similarities and conflicts between menopause and thyroid disease. And then I told you that menopause itself causes your metabolism to slow way down. Your metabolism is how well your body utilizes food for energy. And your thyroid hormones have a lot to do with that. But so does your insulin. So if you have type 2 diabetes, your insulin is wacky. And if your insulin is wacky, then your body does not know how to metabolize glucose. Instead of using it for energy, it stores it as fat. And when it stores too much of it as fat, your entire metabolic system goes out of whack. That is the very essence of type 2 diabetes. So, at postmenopause, you have 3 separate hormonal changes that really mess up your metabolism. 1, you lose